Agent Hart, can you indicate who these messages were being sent from and who these messages were being sent between?
These are messages between Lori Vallow and her brother, Alex Cox.
And can you read the date of these messages into the record?
These three messages are from March 20th of 2019.
When we look at these particular messages, what about them caught your attention?
Alex Cox was a figure during the course of our investigation, and what caught my attention about this particular interaction between Lori Vallow and Alex Cox is in line 1837 that Lori Vallow had to check everything with her, quote, source to make sure she had her information correct, but that it was really good.
Did this indicate to you that Lori herself didn't have this information?
Yes, that's why I think it's significant.
And did you also see in here that Lori was then going to pass that information on to Alex?
Yes.
Did you learn through the investigation who Lori's source was?
Foundation.
Sustain.
Through the investigation, did you see messages from Lori to Chad quite frequently?
Very frequently.
In those messages, was she oftentimes requesting information?
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, would you indicate the date these were sent into the record?
Yes. These four text messages were sent on July 18th of 2019.
What had happened 7 days prior to these messages?
Lori Vallow's husband, Charles Vallow, had been shot and killed.
Through your investigation, did you learn who Hillary was a reference to?
Yes.
And who was that?
Tylee.
And there's also a name in here, Raphael. Did you learn who Raphael referred to?
Raphael is a name, another name used by Chad Daybell between he and Lori Vallow very frequently throughout the course of their communications.
And also a name, James. Do you know who that referred to?
Yes, that is another name for Chad Daybell as referenced in the James and Elena communications between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
And did you learn who Amy was in reference to?
I did not. Could not find out specifically who Amy was.
What about this series of messages stood out to you?
There were three very critical components to these messages.
Can we go through them one by one, please?
Yes.
What was the first one?
The first is line 2667. This is a text that is initiated by Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow, indicating that he has been instructed to focus his efforts on Tylee Ryan.
And what was the second thing that stood out to you?
The second thing is present in the following two lines, 2665 and 2660. Lori Vallow makes a reference to Chad Daybell or a request to find out her, meaning Tylee Ryan's percentage, as well as JJ's percentage. That word is referring to the death percentage for Tylee Ryan and JJ.
Judge, I'm going to object. Calls for speculation. Move to strike.
Overruled.
In fact, in subsequent texts, the
Judge,
exact...
I'm going to object at this point. Non-responsive. There hasn't been a question.
Sustained.
Agent Hart, you were explaining why those lines stood out to you. Could you please continue your explanation?
The words death percentage are used in subsequent texts. This series of text messages is the first in a series of texts that will take place over the next 3 weeks between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. In those text messages, in varying degrees of detail, they refer to the death percentages of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. Those text messages over that course of 3 weeks...
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. It's again becoming a narrative.
Sustained.
And what course of time or what period of time did those messages cover?
Approximately 3 weeks.
And when we look at that line 2660, there is reference to specific percentages, it appears.
Yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Again, this is a message from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow wherein he is indicating his death percentages for Tylee at 0.13 and for JJ at 99.99, which follows with a reference that Raphael or Chad Daybell had visited JJ and told JJ to follow Amy into the light, which is a common reference for death.
In this particular message, there's also a reference to turning up the pain to 10. Who said that again?
Chad Daybell.
And also a reference to placing a spiritual virus in her. Who said that?
Chad Daybell.
And then in that last sentence, did anything about that stand out to you?
Well, line 2660 is a specific conversation regarding the deaths of Lori's children.
Judge, I'm going to object. That's calling for speculation in the conclusion, and I'm going to move to strike.
I'll sustain the objection and strike the response.
Based on your investigation, your experience and review of these messages, what did you believe line 2660 to be referencing?
It's referencing their death percentages.
And who are they?
Tylee and JJ.
And what is Lori's response to that, to the talk of death percentages of her children?
That it's sweet and she misses Chad Daybell desperately.
Was this the first time in these messages that you had seen reference to these death percentages that you can recall?
Yes, this is the first message, and there are several that follow in the next 3 weeks, and then later on there are additional similar conversations regarding Tammy.
Were there additional messages on July 18th of 2019?
Yes, this conversation continues for the next couple of slides.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, you indicated these are a continuation from the messages on the previous slide. Is that correct?
Yes.
What about these particular messages stood out to you?
Primarily lines 26, 22, 2608, and 2607.
Through the investigation, did you become familiar with what has been referred to as the James and Elena story?
Yes.
Did you become familiar with some of the texts that appeared to be a reference or continuation of that story as well?
Yes.
And do you know were you familiar with the term storm?
I am.
And did you know what that was in reference to?
Yes.
And what was that?
That's Chad Daybell's penis.
And Chad's texting to Lori to grab him by his storm and
Judge, I'm going to object
anywhere?
at this point. It's somewhat leading. And I think
Sustain on leading.
What else about that series of three messages caught your attention?
Well, throughout Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow's relationship, Lori is pushing Chad Daybell. And so I included these to show Lori Vallow questioning. Chad Daybell remarks that he'll follow her to the end of the universe. And her response is, when? When might that be? Chad's response is in reference to a planned trip that he would take the following week, July 24th through July 26th of 2019, to be together with Lori Vallow. That's the reference to Wednesday evening to Friday. But we see Lori Vallow pushing Chad Daybell as it relates to their relationship.
So it would be Chad and Lori were going to be together physically or at the same time?
Yes, Chad Daybell traveled to be with Lori Vallow for a period of 2.5 days.
And again, during this time, was Tammy Daybell still alive?
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, I believe you indicated these are a continuation as well from the previous two slides.
They are.
What was it about these messages that caught your attention?
Primarily, there was two things.
And can we go through them one by one?
Sure.
What was the first thing?
The first is again, we see Lori Vallow manipulating Chad Daybell. In the prior slide, Chad Daybell had indicated that they would have this time together Wednesday through Friday. And Lori Vallow's response to that is, then what? And she then says, back to crying and saying goodbye, back to the box, as a reference to being trapped with their inability to be together.
And at this point in time, Charles Vallow has been killed.
This is 1 week following his death.
But Tammy's still alive.
Correct.
And what was the second thing?
The second thing is line 2603, which is Chad Daybell's response to her. And he references that extreme changes are coming for him, and he welcomes those changes.
And do you recall from previous testimony references Chad also made about feeling trapped?
Judge, I'm going to object. It's leading.
World.
Yes.
And do you recall approximately, or do you recall what those statements were, what that was in reference to?
Yes, that conversation took place at the conclusion of this trip that they're talking about. So that would have been on July 26th of 2019, where Chad Daybell references the Harry Potter stories and feeling trapped, having to live under a stairwell, and he gets to escape occasionally to have adventures with his goddess lover.
And when you look at that line 2603, there's a reference to extreme changes. Did that catch your attention?
It did.
What did you, through your investigation and experience, what did you believe that to be in reference to?
Judge, calling for speculation. Objection.
Overruled.
Well, within 3 months of this date, Tylee, JJ, and Tammy are all dead.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these messages were exchanged into the record?
Yes, this is July 20th of 2019.
And who are these messages between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
There's an individual reference named Blake. Did you learn who that was?
Blake is Melanie Boudreau's son.
Do you know his approximate age?
3 to 4 years old at the time of this message.
What about these messages caught your attention?
There were 2 things primarily that caught my attention in this series of communications.
What was the first one?
The first is, again, Lori Vallow is petitioning Chad Daybell to find out Blake's percentage. So repeatedly, we see Lori Vallow asking Chad Daybell to provide that information. Chad Daybell is the source of the death percentages.
What was the second thing?
The second thing is that this is a conversation about a 3 or 4 year old child. And in line 2481, Chad Daybell writes that he decreased that child's pain tolerance to 1% and greatly increased his pain.
And do you recall in one of the previous slides in reference to Tylee Ryan, Chad talking about turning up or causing her pain?
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these messages were exchanged into the record?
July 23rd of 2019.
And who were these messages between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
What about these messages caught your attention?
Again, two things primarily caught my attention.
And what was the first thing?
The first is if we look at the time of these messages, there's an 11-hour gap between line 2276 and 2244. In line 2276, Lori Vallow petitions Chad Daybell to check JJ. In the subsequent line, 11 hours later, she's asking Chad Daybell to check Tylee to see if Tylee has been, quote, switched. And so these messages are 5 days after the initial first message that I ever located regarding death percentages. And so this is now the second time that I could find in the review of the iCloud where Lori Vallow is asking Chad Daybell specifically to check on JJ and then to check on Tylee. So that's the first thing that stood out to me.
And Charles Vallow had been killed not long before these messages.
12 days prior.
What was the second thing that stood out to you?
The second thing that stood out to me is in line 2241, which is Chad Daybell's response to her. And he replies that, yes, Tylee has been switched. And he says, let me know when you can talk and I will explain it. So Chad Daybell is the one who will explain
Judge,
to Lori
I'm going to
Vallow.
object at this point. Speculation.
Overruled.
And what was the last part of that answer?
Lori Vallow is making inquiries to Chad Daybell, and Chad Daybell tells her, I will explain it.
Prior to Charles being killed, are you aware if he was deemed to have been possessed?
He was.
And ultimately he was killed.
He was.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you read the date of these messages into the record?
Yes, July 26th of 2019.
So this is just 3 days after those last messages we looked at?
Correct.
What about these messages caught your attention?
That the pattern of Lori Vallow asking Chad Daybell to check is continuing. So on line 2119, Lori Vallow writes, "Need you to check JJ," and references his behavior, which was a departure from what was normal for him.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you read into the record the date these messages were exchanged?
These messages were also, as with the previous slide, on July 26th, 2019.
What about these particular messages stood out to you?
Well, in response to the previous slide's request by Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell to check JJ, Chad Daybell replies that essentially JJ is still his true self, but he indicates whoever told Lori Vallow that JJ was calm and watching movies had been lying. So Chad Daybell answers Lori Vallow's inquiry regarding checking JJ.
And looking to that next message, are you aware who Brighton is?
Yes.
And who is that?
Brighton is another of Melanie Boudreau's children.
And the name Mel there, do you know who that was referencing?
That's Melanie Boudreau.
Was there anything about that next message that caught your attention?
This next message is somewhat vague, but we see a reference to a big plan, which is a word that we see repeatedly in conversations between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell referencing their plans.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you read the date of these messages into the record?
Yes, these 4 messages were exchanged on July 29th of 2019.
Who were the messages being exchanged between?
Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
What about these particular messages caught your attention?
At this particular time in the investigation, Lori Vallow, Melanie Boudreau, and their children as well as Alex Cox, had decided to take a trip to the California coast. And so these messages were sent to Lori Vallow as they were driving in the car, as Lori Vallow, Melanie Boudreau, Alex Cox, and the children were driving to California. And so Chad Daybell makes an offer to Lori Vallow to cause pain to the two, quote, threes that she was riding with.
And looking at that, at the line 1872, did any of that catch your attention?
Of course. In line 1877, the two threes are referencing two of the children that are in the car with them. And in line 1872, Chad Daybell indicates that he would at least give them a reason to scream, indicating a supposed ability to cause physical pain to those children.
After offering to cause physical pain to the children, what were the next things he said?
He told Lori that he loved, cherished, treasured, and adored her. The wonderful memories just keep coming back. She was mesmerizing, and that Raphael, which is the name for Chad Daybell, is one lucky guy.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, would you read the date of these messages into the record?
These messages were exchanged on July 30th of 2019.
And who are these messages between?
Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
What about these particular messages caught your attention?
There were three very critical components of these messages.
Can we start with the first one?
Yes.
And what was that?
The first one is in line 1781. This is a text initiated by Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow. And you can see that Chad said he had the inspiration to go back to my original death percentages. So this is the first time that we see the full phrase of death percentage, and it is attributable to Chad Daybell by the use of the word my. And then he indicates that these death percentages helped him track Charles, which is a reference to Charles Vallow. Ned is the name of the demonic entity that was alleged to be possessing Charles Vallow. And then he indicates that Tammy is very close. Her death percentage has fallen steadily, and concludes with, "It is encouraging!" exclamation point.
Do you also see the reference in there to Hiplos or Iplos?
Yes.
Do you know who that's in reference to?
That's the name of a demonic entity that was supposed to have been inside of Tammy Daybell.
And you said Tammy on Hiplos.
Yes. So it says Tammy is very close. Her percentage, meaning Tammy's percentage, has fallen steadily since Hiplos left. So that entity is now out of her.
Do you recall if Hiplos was an entity that was indicated to be associated with Charles Vallow?
Judge, I'm going to object. That's leading.
Sustained.
Do you know who else Hiplos may have been associated with?
There was another reference to that using that same demonic entity name with Charles Vallow.
What was the second thing that stood out to you?
The second thing that stood out is this reference to Chad Daybell's death percentages that helped track Charles Vallow. Charles Vallow didn't have a heart attack or pass away in his sleep.
Judge, I'm going to object. It's narrative.
Overruled.
He was shot and killed. And so these death percentages by Chad Daybell are not simply a reference to natural deaths.
And what was the third thing?
Well, the third thing is in lines 1779 and 1778. Lori's response to Chad is to inquire, what is the percentage now? Meaning, what is Tammy Daybell's death percentage? And then she follows that up with yet another inquiry. This would be now the third inquiry about JJ's death percentage. Chad Daybell responds, Tammy is at 3, JJ is at 2.
And based on your review and your investigation, in relation to death percentages, what was the indication the lower the number got?
Well, it's not consistent. So you have references where the lower the number, the closer to death they are. And then you have references where the higher the number, the closer they are. So in the previous communication, you saw Chad Daybell indicate that JJ was at 99.99. And he instructed JJ to follow Amy into the light. In this occasion, we flipped and they're at the opposite end of the spectrum, saying that Tammy is at 3 and now JJ is at 2 versus the prior message. So there's a lack of consistency, but the higher the number in one case, the lower the number in another.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these messages were sent into the record?
Yes, July 30th, 2019. These are a continuation from the previous slide.
And what about these messages stood out to you?
Well, first, Lori Vallow's response back to Chad Daybell after receiving his answer that I believe it was Tammy was at a 3 and JJ was at a 2. She replies 2 and 3%, not 0. So we see Lori Vallow pushing 0, meaning the time has come for those individuals to die.
Judge, objection calls for speculation. I'm going to move to strike, Judge.
Well, the objection's not timely. I'll overrule it at this point, but Ms. Blake, I am concerned if the witness is making his own interpretations of these messages, not based on the investigation. So if you could direct the examination that way, that'll help with the objections.
And in coming to that conclusion, was that based on your experience and your review of the information?
Yes.
What else stood out about this particular message?
Line 1776, where Chad Daybell says, "I will explain when we talk," indicating he is the source of what's happening.
Was that consistent with your review of these messages?
Yes, we see that exact phrase multiple times. "I will explain."
Anything else about this particular series that stood out to you?
Well, lastly, again, we see how Lori Vallow is attempting to manipulate Chad Daybell. She concludes this conversation with, "Okay, still feeling hot for you."
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these were being sent into the record?
These two text messages were also on July 30th of 2019.
And who were these messages between?
Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
What about these particular messages caught your attention?
Two things.
What was the first one?
The first is a continuation to further explain Chad Daybell's death percentages. In the second sentence, he references this chart that checks what percentage mortals are still in their body, and then indicates that it worked for his friend's wife who died. And so we see just a further explanation of death percentages, and that this is talking about physical, real death, not spiritual death or some other kind of death.
Was that chart that was referenced, was a copy of it ever located?
No, we could never find the actual chart. I can't account for where it might be.
And what was the second thing that stood out to you?
Well, there are two more. The first is that he references Tammy Daybell, his wife, that she said she felt lightheaded as if her body and spirit weren't connected.
And then what was the third thing?
The third thing is in line 1773, where Chad Daybell indicates he would update the list and figure out Brandon, Adam, and others. The reference to Brandon is Brandon Boudreau, and on October 2nd of 2019.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. This is definitely becoming a narrative.
Sustained.
Who was Brandon referencing?
Brandon Boudreau.
Do you know of something that happened in relation to Brandon Boudreau?
Yes.
What was that?
On October 2nd, 2019, an attempt was made on his life.
Are you aware of an attempt that was made on Tammy Daybell's life?
Judge, I'm going to object. Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
I am.
And when was that?
October 9th, 2019.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these images were sent?
These were both sent on August 7th of 2019.
Were you able to, looking at that first image there, who is that?
That is Chad Daybell.
Can you tell from the photo what type of building he may be in?
Yes, it's the lobby of an old LDS church.
And who sent that photo?
So the photo of Chad Daybell was sent by Alex Cox to Lori Vallow with the caption, "Look at the bubbies."
Do you know what Bubbies was a reference to?
That was a word.
Judge objections, calling for speculation, no foundation.
I'll sustain that without additional foundation.
Through your investigation and review of messages, were you able to determine what Bubbies was in reference to?
Yes.
And what was that?
It's just simply a pet name that Lori had for Chad Daybell and Alex Cox or other men in her life.
And could you see the time that that message was sent?
10:48 a.m.
And turning to the next image, who are we seeing in that photo?
That's a photograph of Alex Cox.
Does that appear to be in the same location?
Yes.
And what time was that message sent?
1 minute prior on 10:47 a.m.
Who sent that message?
Chad Daybell.
Who did he send it to?
Lori Vallow.
What was the caption that Chad included?
Two exalted beings.
Was Tammy Daybell still alive on August 7th of 2019?
Yes.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. Would you please indicate the date these messages were sent into the record?
These messages were exchanged on August 7th of 2019.
Who were the messages exchanged between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
And these messages were sent on the same day as those two images?
Correct.
What about these messages stood out to you?
The thing that stood out the most in this text series is in line 1391 in the text from Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell, where she indicates, "We are both so tired of taking care of demons. We are weary. Please ask the Lord to take them!" Exclamation point.
And Lori was sending that request to Chad?
Correct.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these messages were sent into the record?
These messages were exchanged on August 10th of 2019.
And is it fair to say that some of the next slides are going to correspond with the same date?
Yes, it's this slide and the next 5 slides are all a continuous exchange of messages between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
What about this first slide with these messages caught your attention in relation to the investigation?
What first caught my attention is we see now, I believe, the 4th time that Lori Vallow is asking Chad Daybell to check on JJ. And Chad Daybell responds once again that JJ is still JJ.
And at this point, Charles has been dead for almost a month.
Correct.
Through the investigation and your review of the information in this case, did Lori have help with JJ prior to Charles passing?
Absolutely.
And who was helping her with him?
Charles Vallow spent a considerable amount of time and effort in caring for
Judge, I'm going to
JJ.
object at this point. Move to strike. There hasn't been sufficient foundation.
Sustained.
Through the review of iCloud, did you review videos?
Yes.
Did you review other content?
Yes.
In that content, were there references to Charles taking care of JJ?
Many.
And at the time these percentages are being pursued, Charles is no longer able to assist with JJ.
Correct.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, you'd indicated this is a continuation of the previous slide.
Yes.
And what about these particular messages caught your attention?
Well, primarily line 1170. In the last line of the previous slide, Lori Vallow asks Chad Daybell if JJ is at 0 yet. And we see Chad Daybell's response to that question, yes, he's at 0. He was probably partly through the veil, talking to people both light and dark.
And on the previous slide, in this one, we again see a reference to Blake. Again, who was Blake?
Blake is Melanie Boudreau's child.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, is this again a continuation of the previous 2 slides?
It is.
Who are these messages being exchanged between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
What about these particular messages stood out to you in relation to the investigation?
This particular conversation is some of the most critical evidence that I located within the iCloud. It represents the clearest and most specific reference.
Judge, I'm going to object again. This is speculation.
Overruled.
It represents the clearest and most specific reference to a plan regarding Tylee and JJ That plan is spearheaded by Chad Daybell.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. That's a narrative and it's argumentative,
It's sustained.
and I'm going to move to strike.
That last part of the comment is stricken.
When you indicate that there's the reference to the plan, who is asking if there's a plan?
Lori Vallow is asking Chad Daybell if there is a, quote, perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children.
What is Chad's response?
Chad's response is that there is a plan being orchestrated for the children.
Where were Tylee and JJ's remains ultimately located?
On Chad Daybell's property.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, is this also a continuation from some of the previous slides?
Yes, it is.
Who are these messages being sent between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
What about these particular messages stood out to you in relation to the investigation?
Well, first off is line 1159. In the previous slide, there was a question about a plan and a verification of a plan. Then Lori Vallow asks Chad Daybell, what should I be doing? And in the subsequent line, 1158, Chad Daybell provides an answer to her, which concludes with being unencumbered and fully free.
There's also a reference in that to telestial issues. Do you know through the investigation what telestial would be referencing?
I do.
What is that?
Issues pertaining to this earthly life.
And in some of the previous messages, Lori was inquiring about the death percentages of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow.
That's correct.
What else stood out in relation to these messages?
Line 1155 is very critical. Chad Daybell texts Lori Vallow and indicates that JJ is, quote, getting close. When I was sitting across from him eating bacon, I sensed he was barely attached to his body.
Do you know when the last time JJ Vallow was seen?
I do.
When was that?
September 22nd, 2019.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, again, is this a continuation of some of those previous slides?
Yes, it is, and I believe there's one more that is part of this conversation.
I'm going to move to that slide and pause to allow the jurors to read that one as well. And going back to that previous slide, what about this one caught your attention?
Well, this is just the continuation of the conversation. I think the more important content is on the following slide.
And what about these particular messages stood out to you?
Primarily lines 1117 and 1113. In 1117, Lori Vallow, as we've seen previously, says to Chad Daybell, I can't wait, literally can't wait. I have no patience. I want you now, with 2 fire emojis. And then we see Chad Daybell's response to that, which point.
Based on your investigation, your review of the content of the iCloud, what did you determine the finish line to be?
The finish line was for Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow to live this fantasy life together that they had constructed and referenced in this plan that they're talking about.